The wood-fired oven at Timber Ridge Inn glowed amber in the pre-dawn darkness of November 3rd, 1921, its brick throat wide enough to roast a side of venison or bake 20 loaves at once. Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway bent closer, his lantern throwing shadows across the ash bed, and saw what looked like a femur nestled among the coals, polished white, too straight and heavy to be deer. He reached for it with his gloved hand, felt the weight, and understood immediately that the couple who'd served him pot roast only 6 hours earlier had been feeding him something no Christian should name aloud. Behind him, Sheriff Clemens vomited onto the flagstones. The inn smelled of rosemary and rendered fat, the same comforting scent that had greeted 100 travelers over 3 years. And in the root cellar below, they would find 23 sets of personal effects. Wallets, rings, spectacles, arranged on shelves like pantry goods, each tagged with a name and the date of Last Supper. The highway between Eugene and Florence cut through Douglas fir forests so dense that motorists claimed daylight never fully arrived, even at noon. Mist rolled off the Cioslaw River year-round, settling into the hollows and turning the gravel roads slick as rendered lard. By 1921, the automobile had conquered most of Oregon, but this 40-mile stretch remained treacherous. Hairpin curves, mud ruts deep enough to snap an axle, and stretches where the canopy grew so thick that headlamps did little more than silver the fog. Timber Ridge Inn sat at mile marker 17, the only structure for 8 miles in either direction. A 2-story clapboard building painted barn red with white trim, it advertised itself with a hand-lettered sign nailed to a Douglas fir: hot meals, clean beds, fair rates. The proprietors were Elias and Constance Vout, a couple in their late 40s who'd arrived from Idaho in the winter of 1918, claiming the previous owner, a man named Sorensen, had sold them the property before heading to Alaska. No one in the county had bothered to verify the story. The Vouts were polite, industrious, and their pot roast was exceptional. Elias stood 5'6" with the compact build of a man who'd worked lumber camps. His hands were scarred from saw work, his face weathered but pleasant. He spoke little and smiled less, but travelers reported he was fair with prices and quick to help fix a broken fan belt or patch a tire. Constance was taller, almost 5'9", with the kind of prairie-hardened beauty that made men tip their hats twice. Sharp cheekbones, gray eyes, hands that could wring a chicken's neck or roll pastry with equal efficiency. The inn catered to a specific clientele: traveling salesmen heading to the coast, loggers moving between camps, young men chasing timber work or fishing boats, occasionally a family, though most families avoided the route after dark. The Vouts offered 4 guests rooms upstairs, a dining room that seated 12, and meals served family style at 6 in the evening. Breakfast was extra, payment in advance. No one who ate there complained. The pot roast was legendary, so tender it fell apart with a fork, seasoned with herbs Constance grew in a kitchen garden, served with roasted root vegetables and thick gravy that guests sopped up with fresh bread. Men who'd eaten at the finest hotels in Portland claimed they'd never tasted better. Elias would emerge from the kitchen to refill coffee cups, his expression neutral, while Constance moved between tables with a carafe of something she called tonic wine, a dark, slightly bitter drink she claimed aided digestion. The first disappearance that anyone noticed happened in March of 1920. A salesman named Arthur Gaines, representing a shoe company out of Seattle, stopped at the inn on his way to Florence. His employer received a telegram saying Gaines had been delayed by weather, but would complete his route within the week. He never arrived. His sample cases were eventually found in a pawn shop in Coos Bay, sold by a man matching no description in particular. The investigation went nowhere. Salesmen went missing on bad roads all the time. The second was a logger named Tom Ridley in June. He'd been fired from a camp near Sweet Home and was heading west to try the coast. His sister in Eugene filed a missing person report after 3 months of silence. The sheriff's office noted it and filed it with a dozen others. Men walked away from their lives. It was the American disease. By October of 1921, the county had 7 open missing person cases involving men who'd last been seen heading toward or past Timber Ridge. No one had connected them yet. The distances were too great, the men too transient, the reasons for disappearing too plausible. What finally broke the pattern was a woman. Helen Marsh was 42, widowed 3 years, traveling from Eugene to her sister's home in Florence to help with a difficult childbirth. She left Eugene on the morning of October 28, 1921, driving a Ford Model T she'd inherited from her late husband. She was expected by evening. When she didn't arrive, her sister's husband, a mill supervisor named Donald Pruitt, telephoned the sheriff. Sheriff William Clemens was 58, a former railroad detective who'd won election on promises to clean up bootlegging. He took the missing woman report seriously in a way he hadn't taken the missing men reports. A woman driving alone was still uncommon enough to be noticed. A woman with family connections who could afford telephone calls and attorneys was different from a drifter who might be sleeping off drink in a Seattle flophouse. Clemens organized a search party the next morning. 6 men on horseback and 2 automobiles traveled the Eugene-Florence route, stopping at every structure. They reached Timber Ridge Inn at 11:30 in the morning. Elias Vout met them at the door, wiping his hands on an apron. Had they seen a woman driving a Ford, alone, the day before? Elias shook his head. They'd had 3 guests the previous night, all men, all loggers heading to the coast. He provided names that matched no records. The men had paid in cash and left at dawn. Constance appeared from the kitchen, her face showing appropriate concern. Such a terrible thing. A woman traveling alone. These roads were dangerous. Perhaps her automobile had gone off into a ravine. The search party moved on. They found Helen Marsh's Model T 2 miles west of the inn, nosed into a ditch, front axle cracked. No sign of the woman herself. Searchers combed the forest for 3 days. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no indication she'd climbed out and walked. It was as if she'd vanished from the driver's seat. Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway, who'd been seconded from the federal office in Portland, had a question no one else was asking. If the automobile went into the ditch before it reached the inn, why hadn't Mrs. Marsh walked back to get help? The inn was closer than anything ahead, unless she'd already passed it, but the ditch was on the Eugene side. He returned to Timber Ridge Inn alone on November 2nd. Holloway was 31, a veteran of the Western Front who'd come home with a Purple Heart and a distrust of anything that looked too clean. He'd joined the Marshal Service because railroad work didn't satisfy the part of him that needed to see what people hid. He arrived at the inn just after 4 in the afternoon, as the autumn sun bled orange through the fir trees and mist began rising from the valley floor. Elias greeted him at the door. Holloway asked if he could rent a room and take supper. Elias hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before nodding. 1 night. $6, meals included, payment in advance. Holloway paid and was shown to a room on the 2nd floor, small but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window overlooking the woods. The floorboards were scrubbed pale, the walls smelled of lye soap. He tested the bed frame, opened the wardrobe, looked under the wash basin. Nothing unusual, except the wardrobe had fresh scratches on the inside of the door, as if someone had clawed at it from within. Supper was served at 6. Holloway was the only guest. He sat at the long table while Constance brought out the meal. Pot roast, roasted carrots and turnips, bread still warm from the oven, a gravy boat filled with something dark and rich. The meat was extraordinary. So tender it seemed to melt. Seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. He ate 2 helpings while Constance refilled his coffee, and Elias watched from the kitchen doorway. "You're with the law," Elias said. Not a question. Holloway nodded. "Marshal's service, looking into the missing woman. Terrible thing. You find anything?" "Not yet." Holloway sipped his coffee. It tasted faintly medicinal. "You serve pot roast often?" "Most nights. It's what travelers want. Something warm and filling." "Where do you source your meat?" "We buy cattle from a rancher in Mapleton. Sometimes venison when hunters pass through." Constance brought out a slice of pie. Apple, fragrant with cinnamon. Holloway ate it slowly, watching them both. Elias had returned to the kitchen. Constance cleared plates with the efficiency of someone who'd worked hotel dining rooms, but her eyes kept darting to the window, as if checking for something in the gathering dark. "You two been here long?" Holloway asked. 3 years this December." Constance poured him more coffee without being asked. "Quiet life. Good for the soul." "You ever get trouble? Robberies, vagrant types?" "Once or twice. Elias handles it." Holloway finished his pie and climbed the stairs to his room. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark with his service revolver on his lap, listening. The inn creaked and settled. Downstairs he heard low voices, the Vaughts arguing about something. He couldn't make out words, but Constance's tone was sharp, Elias's conciliatory. At 3 a.m, Holloway heard something else, a scraping sound from below, rhythmic and metallic. He descended the stairs in his socks, avoiding the boards he'd memorized as creaking. The sound came from the kitchen. He eased the door open an inch. The wood-fired oven glowed red. Elias stood before it with a long iron poker, raking coals. The oven door was open, and in the firelight, Holloway saw what looked like the curve of a ribcage settling into ash. Elias worked methodically, breaking apart whatever was inside, pushing fragments deeper into the coals. The smell was pork, or something like it. Sweet and greasy. Holloway let the door close. He climbed the stairs, dressed quickly, and left through his window, shimmying down a porch column and running for his automobile parked a quarter-mile down the road. He reached Eugene by dawn and went directly to Sheriff Clemens. The raid came that night. They brought 8 men. Sheriff Clemens, Deputy Holloway, 4 county deputies, and 2 volunteers from the Eugene Fire Brigade who'd been told they might need to handle a structure fire. They arrived at Timber Ridge Inn at 7:43 p.m. on November 3rd, 1921. 3 automobiles running with headlamps dark until the final approach. Elias Vaught answered the door with a dish rag in his hand. He looked at the assembled men, and his expression didn't change. No surprise, no fear, just a kind of flat recognition. He stepped aside without being asked. Constance appeared at the top of the stairs, still dressed in her kitchen apron, and descended slowly, her hands loose at her sides. "We're searching the premises," Clemens said. "You're both detained." "On what charge?" Elias's voice was calm. "Suspicion of murder." Constance laughed. A single sharp sound. "You'll need more than suspicion." The search started in the guest rooms. Empty, clean, Nothing of note except those scratches in the wardrobes, present in 3 of the 4 rooms, all on the inside of doors, all at shoulder height. The deputies moved to the vault's private quarters. More nothing. Clothes folded neatly in a bureau, a bed made with military precision, a bookshelf holding a Bible, a copy of the Virginian, and a ledger. Holloway opened the ledger. It was a standard inn register. Names, dates, payments. He flipped through 3 years of entries, dozens of names, all men except for 2. One of those names was Helen Marsh. Entered on October 28th, room 3 paid $6. Holloway showed it to Clemens. She stayed here. We told you she didn't, Elias said. He stood in the doorway, still holding that dish rag. Someone must have forged it. The deputies moved to the kitchen. The wood-fired oven dominated one wall, brick and iron, built deep into the structure. Holloway had them rake out the coals. In the ash bed, they found bone fragments. A deputy with medical training examined them and went pale. These are human. Femur, tibia, multiple individuals. They found the cellar entrance behind a shelf of preserves in the pantry. A trap door, hinged with new iron. Elias didn't protest when they opened it. He watched with that same flat expression as Clemens descended with a lantern. The cellar was dry, lined with stone, about 15 feet square. Shelves ran along 3 walls. On those shelves sat personal effects organized with the care of a museum exhibit. Wallets, each containing identification papers, pocket watches, eyeglasses, wedding rings, women's hairpins. A leather purse with Helen Marsh's name embossed inside. Everything was tagged with a slip of paper noting a name and date. Clemens counted 23 sets of effects. The dates ran from February of 1919 through October 28, 1921. Some names matched missing person reports. Most didn't. Men who'd never been reported missing because no one had been looking. In the corner sat a metal trunk. Inside were clothes, shirts, trousers, dresses, all cleaned and folded. And beneath the clothes, wrapped in oilcloth, were butcher's tools, cleavers, bone saws, skinning knives, all recently sharpened, all showing trace residue that would later test as human blood. Above the cellar, Constance Vaught said, "You should arrest us now, before this becomes more difficult for everyone." They were taken to the Lane County Jail in Eugene and separated. Elias Vaught asked for a lawyer. Constance Vaught asked for coffee and a cigarette, then told them everything. The confession began at 9:22 p.m. and lasted until 3:30 in the morning. A court stenographer recorded it. Sheriff Clemens and Deputy Holloway took turns asking questions. Constance answered with a directness that unnerved both men. No tears, no hysteria, no attempts to minimize. She spoke about murder the way another woman might discuss canning tomatoes. The Vaught's had arrived in Oregon in January of 1919, not from Idaho, but from a failed homestead in eastern Montana. They'd lost everything to drought and debt. The real owner of Timber Ridge Inn, a Norwegian named Sorensen, had indeed gone north, but not to Alaska. He was buried under the kitchen floor. They'd killed him the second night after arriving, when he'd threatened to report them to the sheriff for squatting. "We didn't plan it," Constance said, lighting her second cigarette from the stub of her first. "But once it was done, we realized something. No one knew us here. No one was coming to check on Sorensen. We had a building, a business, and a road full of people nobody would miss. The first deliberate killing happened in February. A drifter named Jack Talley, heading to Portland, stopped for a meal. Elias drugged his coffee with laudanum purchased from a pharmacy in Florence under a false name. Talley collapsed in the dining room. They dragged him to the cellar, bludgeoned him with a firewood axe, butchered him in a wash basin, and burned the remains in the oven over 2 nights. "We were starving," Constance said. "The inn wasn't making money. We had no credit in town. We needed meat to serve if anyone else came through. So we used what we had." She said this without irony, without shame, as if it were a problem of inventory. The second victim was easier, a logger in March, then another in May. By summer of 1919, they'd refined the process. Identify solitary travelers, serve them drugged food or drink, kill them quickly, butcher them cleanly, burn the bones. Keep the possessions as insurance. If questions ever arose, they could prove the victims had been somewhere else, using their identification papers to send telegrams or pawn their belongings in distant cities. "We learned from the first one that you can't serve it immediately," Constance explained. "The texture is wrong. You have to cure it, age it, treat it like venison. 3 to 4 weeks if you do it right. Then it's indistinguishable." Clemens interrupted. "You fed human meat to guests." "Not always. We still bought beef when we could afford it. But yes, most of the time that's what we served." "People ate it and didn't notice?" "People believe what you tell them. You say it's pot roast. Serve it with gravy and rosemary. They taste pot roast. The mind fills in what it expects." Holloway asked about Helen Marsh. Constance's expression flickered, something almost like regret. "That one was a mistake. We usually avoided women. Too much attention when they disappear. But she stopped at twilight, her automobile already damaged. Said she'd hit a hole in the road. Needed to use the telephone. We didn't have a telephone. Elias told her he could fix the axle in the morning. Offered her a room. She accepted. They drugged her tea. She collapsed in the dining room. Elias carried her to the cellar. They killed her the same way they'd killed the others. Blow to the back of the head, quick and efficient. But the automobile was a problem. They couldn't leave it near the inn. Elias drove it 2 miles west and nosed it into the ditch, then walked back through the woods. "We knew it would bring attention. We thought we'd have time to leave before anyone connected it to us. But you came back too fast." Constance looked at Holloway. "You didn't eat enough to affect you. Most people finish 3 servings. You only had 2. The laudanum in the food, the tonic wine. All of it dosed carefully to induce drowsiness or unconsciousness without immediate suspicion. Some guests had fought the drug, tried to make it to their rooms, collapsed in the hallways. The scratch marks in the wardrobes. They woke up locked in," Constance said. "Realized what was happening. Tried to get out. We always waited until morning to finish it. Easier when they'd exhausted themselves." Clemens asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Why keep doing it? You had the inn. You could have run a legitimate business." Constance crushed her cigarette and immediately lit another. For the first time, her composure cracked. "You think we haven't asked ourselves that? The first few were necessity, survival, but after that?" She inhaled deeply. "After that, it was easier than the alternative, easier than scraping by, easier than begging credit from bankers who'd spit on us. Every man we killed was someone who'd never given us a second thought when we were starving on that Montana homestead. Every rich salesman, every logger with cash in his pocket, every person who passed through and didn't see us as human. We took back what the world refused to give. Vengeance, not hunger. Not after the first year." The confession hit the Eugene Guard on November 5th. By November 7th, it had reached the Oregonian, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the wire services. By November 9th, journalists from New York and Chicago were camped outside the Lane County Courthouse. The term pot roast killers appeared in the first sensational headline and stuck. Eugene, a city of 15,000, reeled. Dozens of families realized they'd eaten at Timber Ridge Inn. Some had done so multiple times. A lumber company supervisor named Walter Gaines realized he'd shared a table with the Vaughts on 3 occasions over 2 years, always commenting on the quality of the meat. His brother Arthur, the missing salesman, had last been seen heading to Florence in March of 1920. The revelation triggered mass hysteria. Churches held emergency prayer services. The city health officer issued a statement assuring residents that anyone who'd eaten at the inn was not in danger. Human meat carried no inherent pathogens different from other game. This statement was intended to calm. Instead, it made everything worse. People vomited from psychosomatic revulsion. Families refused to eat beef. A butcher shop in Eugene was vandalized after a rumor spread that it had purchased meat from the Vaughts. 3 men who'd worked with the Vaughts faced vigilante threats. A delivery driver who'd brought supplies to the inn had his house burned. A rancher who'd occasionally sold them cattle received death threats. The complicity panic spread like fever. Who had known? Who had helped? Who had looked away? The answer, uncomfortable and unavoidable, was that everyone had looked away. 7 missing person reports over 3 years, all of them men traveling the same stretch of road. No one had connected them because no one had wanted to. Missing men were a paperwork problem, not a crisis. The system had failed because the system was designed to ignore certain kinds of victims. Reverend Thomas Alcott of the First Presbyterian Church gave a sermon on November 13th that tried to address the communal guilt. We ask ourselves how such evil could flourish in our midst. But evil flourishes when good people decide that someone else's suffering is not their concern. Those men who died were strangers to us, and so we gave their disappearances no weight. We are all complicit in our indifference. The sermon was not well received. Most congregants wanted a simpler story. Monsters in human skin, aberrations, evil that could be locked away and forgotten. The idea that their own disregard had enabled the Vaughts was too heavy to carry. What would you do if someone you passed on the road went missing, and the investigation felt like more effort than it was worth? Would you push for answers, or trust the authorities were handling it? Elias Vaught remained silent for 6 days after his arrest. His lawyer, a Portland attorney named Harrison Beale, advised him to say nothing. But on November 9th, Elias requested a meeting with Deputy Holloway. No lawyers, no stenographers, just the 2 of them. They met in an interrogation room at 8 in the evening. Elias looked diminished in jail clothes, his compact frame seeming almost frail under the electric bulb, but his eyes were steady. "You're the one who figured it out," Elias said. "That deserves an honest conversation." Holloway said nothing, waiting. "My wife told you we started from hunger. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Elias folded his hands on the table. "In Montana, we had neighbors, homesteaders like us. They had food stored, and we didn't. I asked to buy some. They refused, said we should have planned better. 2 weeks later, we found their son, 8 years old, frozen in a ditch. He'd wandered off during a storm. We buried him. Told them we were sorry. They blamed us anyway. Said if we'd been real neighbors, we would have found him sooner." He paused, looking at the wall. "When we left Montana, we weren't fleeing drought. We were fleeing charges. Someone claimed we'd stolen cattle. We hadn't. But accusation is proof when you're poor. We ran, got to Oregon with nothing. Sorensen let us stay one night. Then he saw how desperate we were and threatened to turn us in for vagrancy, unless Constance... Elias trailed off. He made a suggestion she couldn't accept. So you killed him. So I killed him. And when it was done, I realized no one would come looking. No one cared about him either. He was a bachelor running an inn in the middle of nowhere. His family in Norway hadn't written in years. We buried him and became him. Elias leaned forward. Every person we killed after that? They reminded me of someone. The salesman who wouldn't buy from us in Montana. The banker who foreclosed. The sheriff who looked at Constance like she was property. I'm not saying they were those people, but they were the same type. And every time we served one of them to the next traveler, I felt like I was feeding the world its own poison. It was the closest thing to philosophy Elias offered. Not justification, but a grim logic. The Vaults had created a closed system where the predatory class cannibalized itself without knowing. Traveling men, confident in their own importance, eating the flesh of traveling men who'd been equally confident last month. Did you feel guilt? Holloway asked. Elias considered. Not the way you mean. I felt something. But guilt implies you think you did wrong. I'm not certain we did. We survived. They died. That's the contract the world wrote. We just enforced it. The conversation ended there. Holloway left feeling colder than when he'd entered. The trial began on January 9th, 1922. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Samuel Morton, a man known for thoroughness and a deliberate courtroom manner. The defense, despite Attorney Beale's skill, had an impossible task. The Vaults had confessed. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The only question was whether they would hang. The trial lasted 11 days. Over 80 exhibits were entered into evidence. Among them, the cellar ledger listing 23 victims by name and date. The entries were in Constance's handwriting, meticulous as a recipe book. Some included notations. Yielded 32 pounds usable. Tough, possibly overworked. Require longer curing. Bone fragments recovered from the oven. A forensic expert from the University of Oregon testified they belonged to at least 6 individuals, including one consistent with Helen Marsh's skeletal proportions. The trunk of butcher's tools. Each knife and saw bore microscopic tissue residue. Blood typing tests, still new science in 1922, indicated human origin. Photographs of the wardrobe scratches, deep gouges in wood, showing the panic of someone who'd woken drugged and trapped. Testimony from guests who'd survived dining at the inn. A logger named Pete Rawlings testified he'd eaten there in September and felt strange afterward. Dizzy, confused, barely able to drive. He'd attributed it to bad moonshine. Now he understood. The laudanum bottle, purchased in Florence under the name Mrs. Ellen Voss. The pharmacist identified Constance from a photograph, but the most damning piece came from the cellar itself. Behind a loose stone, investigators found a journal belonging to Constance. 50 pages of entries detailing not just the mechanics of murder, but her thoughts. February 9th, 1919. First one was hardest. Second was easier. Wonder if the third will feel like routine. August 4th, 1920. Elias worries we've become what we fled. I tell him we've become what we needed to become. October 20th, 1921. The inn is a kind of church. People come seeking comfort and leave transformed. We are the sacrament. The journal was read aloud in court. Several jurors wept. Constance sat motionless through it, her face giving nothing away. The defense argued insanity, that the trauma of poverty and isolation had broken something fundamental in both defendants. A psychologist testified that prolonged starvation could induce moral disintegration. It was a thin argument, and no one believed it. The prosecution's closing argument took 3 hours. Morton walked the jury through each victim, showing photographs of their effects, reading from letters found in their wallets. He ended with Helen Marsh, a widow, traveling to help her sister. She stopped at an inn seeking shelter and instead found monsters. She is buried in pieces somewhere in those woods, or burned to ash, or served to strangers who complimented the meal. That is what these defendants did. Not once in desperation, but 23 times over 3 years. They are not insane. They are calculating, and they must pay the only price that balances the scale. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Samuel Harris sentenced both to death by hanging. Execution set for May 12, 1922. Neither Elias nor Constance reacted to the sentence. They were led from the courtroom without looking back. The Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem held both Vaughts in separate cells on death row. They were not allowed contact. Constance wrote letters to Elias that were confiscated and never delivered. Elias wrote nothing. He spent his days reading the Bible and ignoring the chaplain who visited weekly. Appeals were filed and denied. The governor received 300 letters demanding clemency and 700 demanding the execution proceed immediately. One letter from a woman in Portland argued that Constance must have been coerced by her husband and deserved mercy. Another, from a man in Eugene, suggested public torture before death. The governor, Ben Olcott, declined to intervene. During those 5 months, journalists tried repeatedly to interview the Vaughts. Most were turned away. But in late April, Constance agreed to speak with a reporter from the Oregonian, a woman named Margaret Keller, who'd written extensively about women in the criminal justice system. The interview took place on April the 24th, 1922. Keller asked Constance if she felt remorse. "Remorse requires believing you had a choice," Constance replied. "We had no choice. We were drowning, and we grabbed whatever kept us afloat. If that was other people's lives, so be it. The world had already decided we were expendable. We just extended that logic." Keller pushed. "You killed women too. Helen Marsh was unlucky. I do regret her. Not because killing a woman is worse than killing a man, but because she was like me, alone, trying to survive. If I could undo one death, it would be hers. What about the others? They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Men like that, traveling alone, nobody waiting for them, living hand to mouth, they were ghosts before we ever touched them. We gave their deaths meaning. We fed other travelers. We kept the inn running. They became part of something larger than their own pointless drifting." The interview was published on April 27th. Public reactions split. Some saw it as monstrous rationalization. Others, particularly women who'd known poverty, admitted a disquieting recognition. The world did treat certain people as disposable. The Vaughts had simply said it aloud. Elias never gave interviews, but he sent one letter to his sister in Montana, a woman named Ruth he hadn't contacted in 5 years. The letter was intercepted and later released to the press. It read, in part, "I won't ask forgiveness. You wouldn't give it, and I don't want it. But I need you to know we weren't devils. We were people the world broke, and we broke back. If there's a God, maybe he'll understand that. If there's not, then none of this mattered anyway. The letter was his only public statement. On May 7, 1922, 5 days before the scheduled execution, Timber Ridge Inn burned to the ground. The fire started at 2:13 in the morning and was discovered by a passing motorist who saw flames through the trees. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived from Eugene, the structure was fully engulfed. Arson investigators found evidence of accelerant. Kerosene splashed across the kitchen and dining room. No suspects were identified, no arrests made, but everyone understood the message. Someone wanted that building erased. Whether it was a family member of a victim, a guest who'd eaten there, or just someone who needed to believe evil could be purified by fire, the inn was gone. The oven collapsed into the foundation. The cellar caved in. Constance's garden was scorched black. Only the stone chimney remained standing, a solitary marker in the ashes. Sheriff Clemens investigated, but made little effort. He told reporters, "Sometimes a community needs to bury its ghosts. Can't say I blame whoever did this." The destruction of the inn didn't change the legal proceedings, but it changed the emotional landscape. With the building gone, the horror felt more containable. A story with an ending. Monsters in a place that no longer existed. On May 10th, 2 days before execution, Constance requested a meeting with the warden. She had a favor to ask. She wanted to see Elias one last time. The warden denied it. Death row policy prohibited inmate contact. Constance then asked if she could write him a letter that would actually be delivered. The warden agreed. She wrote 3 pages. The letter was sealed and given to Elias on the morning of May 11th. He read it alone in his cell and asked the guard to burn it afterward. The guard later told a journalist he'd glanced at the first paragraph before burning it. It began, "We did what we had to. Never doubt that. Never regret." That afternoon, Constance had a second request. She wanted to know what would happen to their bodies after execution. The warden explained they'd be buried in the prison cemetery in unmarked graves, per standard protocol for executed criminals. Constance nodded. "Good. No markers. No names. Let us disappear the way they did." She spent her final night awake, sitting on her cot, staring at the wall. When the chaplain offered prayer, she declined. "I made my peace a long time ago. It's not with God." Elias spent his final night the same way he'd spent every other, reading. He finished the book of Job and left it open on his cot. The executions were scheduled for dawn. Constance first at 6 a.m., Elias 30 minutes later. Oregon law required separate hangings. Witnesses included Sheriff Clemens, Deputy Holloway, District Attorney Morton, the warden, a physician, 2 journalists, and 3 men who'd lost family members to the votes. Constance was brought to the gallows at 5:58. She wore a plain gray dress provided by the prison. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were bound behind her. She walked steadily up the 13 steps, refusing assistance. The executioner, a man whose name was never released, placed the noose. The warden read the death warrant. "Any final words?" Constance looked at the witnesses. "You'll eat each other soon enough. You won't even need a reason." The trap dropped at 6:04. Death was instantaneous. Elias followed at 6:32. He climbed the steps without expression. When asked for final words, he said only, "We were hungry." The trap dropped at 6:37. The bodies were cut down, examined by the physician, and buried before noon in graves separated by 100 yards. No services were held. The locations were not marked on any prison map. By evening, the press had dispersed. The story was over. The vote's death didn't end the story. It metastasized into something stranger. Within a month, 2 members of the jury fell ill with severe digestive disorders. One, a banker named Thomas Leland, wasted away over 6 weeks despite doctors finding no organic cause. He died in July, claiming he could taste rosemary in everything he ate. The second, a shopkeeper named Harold Vines, developed a psychological aversion to meat. He became vegetarian, lost 60 pounds, and eventually moved to California. 3 of the trial witnesses suffered nightmares. One man, Carl Jeffries, whose brother had been identified among the victims, began sleepwalking. His wife found him in their kitchen at 3 in the morning, standing before the oven, whispering something she couldn't understand. He was later committed to the Oregon State Hospital. The restaurant industry in Eugene collapsed. 7 establishments closed within 6 months. People stopped eating out. The few restaurants that survived did so by displaying their supply chains publicly, hanging beef carcasses in windows, bringing customers into kitchens, providing receipts from ranchers. Trust, once broken, required constant proof. But the strangest phenomenon was the letters. Over the next 3 years, the Oregonian received 47 anonymous letters claiming to be from fellow travelers, people who confessed to similar acts in other states. Montana, Idaho, Nevada, remote inns and roadside diners where proprietors fed their guests something more than advertised. Most were hoaxes, some were probably real. A retired U.S. Marshal named William Garrett spent 5 years investigating these claims. He identified 3 other cases between 1917 and 1923 where innkeepers were suspected, but never proven, of murdering guests. 1 in Wyoming, 1 in Northern California, 1 in British Columbia. The pattern was consistent. Remote locations, transient victims, excellent food, no bodies. Garrett published his findings in a 1928 monograph titled The Cannibal Hostelries of the American West. It sold poorly and is now a collector's item. His conclusion: the Vaughts were not unique. They were simply the ones who got caught. In 1953, a surveyor working for the Oregon Department of Transportation discovered something while mapping the Eugene-Florence Highway for widening. At the site where Timber Ridge Inn had stood, now just a cleared lot overgrown with blackberry, his ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies. 11 separate locations showing density consistent with buried remains. The state declined to excavate. The official reason was cost. The real reason was public relations. 30 years had passed. Everyone involved was dead or old. Digging up bones would reopen a wound Oregon had worked hard to scar over. The surveyor, a man named Donald Chen, leaked his findings to a Portland newspaper. The story ran on page 9 and generated no follow-up. By the 1950s, the Vaughts were a footnote, a gruesome anomaly from a rougher era. But in Lane County, memory persisted differently. Families with roots in 1921, Eugene still didn't talk about the inn. Children were told vague warnings about the stretch of highway where it had stood. The local historical society omitted the Vaughts from its published county history. It was a communal decision to forget, or try to. The site remains undeveloped. In 2007, a developer proposed building a rest stop there. Public opposition killed the project within weeks. A petition gathered 800 signatures. The stated reason was environmental concerns. The real reason was never spoken. Today, if you drive the highway between Eugene and Florence, there's nothing at mile marker 17 except forest and a small gravel turnout. No historical marker. No sign that anything ever stood there. But on foggy mornings, and Oregon has many, locals still avoid stopping. They keep driving until the next town, even if their tank reads near empty, even if they need a restroom. Old fear dies hard. The Eugene Public Library archives hold the trial transcripts and evidence photographs, restricted access only. Researchers must provide valid identification and a written statement of purpose. Few people bother. The Vaughts have been absorbed into the larger category of American murder couples, less famous than the Barkers, more disturbing than most, remembered only by specialists and the morbidly curious. But here's what persists. Every few years, a hiker exploring the overgrown foundation claims to smell wood smoke and rosemary, though no fire burns. Every few years, someone driving that stretch at twilight sees what looks like lamplight through the trees, though no structure stands. And every few years, the Oregon State Police receives a missing person report for someone last seen heading west on that highway. Though those cases always resolve. People turn up in Portland or Seattle, delayed but safe. Or almost always. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.